If you want to know the hour at our house, you don't need a clock. You need ears. When the elevator cables hum in the shaft at 10:59 and stop with a blunt cough, it means our resident immovable object is descending from the orchids. When the kitchen door clicks at 11:15 and a gentler domestic weather front wafts in, Fritz carrying something that has learned to simmer like a philosopher, it means we are not to be disturbed by phone, doorbell, fire, flood, or the renewed ambitions of the Internal Revenue Service. When the bell rings at 10:42 with the kind of insistence that suggests someone believes urgency trumps protocol, it means trouble has developed opinions about our peaceful morning. I was at my desk reconciling last month's expenses, which is my favorite way to appreciate the finer things in life, when the doorbell delivered its editorial on the subject of patience. I glanced at the clock, 10:42, and let out a sigh that was part habit and part preemptive apology to the orchids 3 floors above. The hall mirror caught me straightening my tie on the way to the front door, and through the glass I caught a glimpse of someone who had dressed for the occasion of being taken seriously. She was wrapped in a charcoal wool coat that had been tailored by someone who understood that elegance was a form of armor. The face above it was a study in controlled determination, with more character than a powder and the kind of bone structure that suggested good breeding and better resolve. She held gloves in one hand and what looked like a leather portfolio in the other, and her posture suggested she was prepared to wait exactly as long as necessary and not 1 second longer. "Mr. Goodwin." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in large rooms full of important people. There was cultivation in it, and several decades of getting her way through sheer force of competence. "That would be me," I said, "and you would be someone who believes 10:42 is an appropriate time to conduct business with a man who doesn't acknowledge the existence of morning appointments." "I would be someone," she said, "who believes murder takes precedence over scheduling." She didn't smile when she said it, which gave the words more weight than they might have carried from someone with a sense of humor about homicide. I stood aside and let her into the vestibule, then into the office, with the feeling of a man who had just agreed to carry a lit stick of dynamite past a room full of newspapers. The office received her with its usual dignity, the big globe lamp casting its benediction over the scene, my desk looking appropriately busy with the morning's correspondence, the red leather chair positioned for maximum psychological advantage, and the big chair behind the massive desk standing empty like a throne waiting for its king. She remained standing and turned in a slow circle, taking inventory of the room with the practiced eye of someone who was accustomed to evaluating real estate, art collections, and the relative net worth of potential allies. "I'm in the right place," she said, more to herself than to me. "Good. If you've come about murder," I said, "you might want to be more specific. We get a lot of people who think someone ought to be murdered, fewer who think someone will be, and even fewer who think someone has been. Which category are you in?" She set her gloves on the edge of my desk like someone placing a calling card, and I noticed her hands were steady. Whatever had brought her here, it wasn't panic. "Someone will be murdered tonight," she said, "at the Metropolitan Opera, during the opening performance of our new production of Tosca. And you know this how?" She opened the portfolio and extracted 3 envelopes, cream-colored and expensive, the kind of stationery that announces its quality before you read the contents. She arranged them on my desk blotter like evidence in a court case. "These arrived on 3 successive mornings. They were slipped under my door at the Carlisle." I picked up the first envelope. The postmark was local, but there was something about the cancellation that suggested it had been processed through a private mail service rather than the regular post office. The paper felt substantial between my fingers, the kind that cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. "You opened them?" "Of course." She extracted 3 sheets of matching paper and laid them out beside the envelopes. "I'm not in the habit of leaving threatening correspondence unread." The first note was typed on what looked like an expensive machine, though the ribbon needed changing and someone had been heavy-handed with the keys. It read, "The curtain will fall on more than Tosca tonight. When Scarpia meets his fate, he will not be alone in death. The dagger meant for him will find a different heart." The second was more direct. "Your modern interpretation has offended those who understand true art. Blood will be the critic's final review." The third made my skin crawl a little. "In Act 2, when the knife falls, look to the wings. The real tragedy will not be on the stage." "Charming," I said, handing them back. "Any idea who your correspondent might be?" "I have several ideas," she said, settling into the red leather chair without being invited. "None of them pleasant, and all of them with access to the Metropolitan Opera House. Speaking of which, you haven't told me who you are or why someone would want to kill you over an opera." She straightened in the chair, and I got the impression I was about to receive a formal introduction. "I am Victoria Pemberton. I serve on the board of directors of the Metropolitan Opera, and I was the deciding vote in favor of our current production of Tosca. It is a controversial interpretation." "Controversial how?" "The director has set the opera in 1940s New York rather than Napoleonic Rome. Tosca is a nightclub. Singer, Cavara Dossier is a war correspondent, and Scarpia is a corrupt police chief. Some people consider this an abomination. Others consider it brilliant. The divide has been passionate." I was beginning to get the picture. In my experience, when people start killing over art, it's rarely about the art itself. It's about money, power, reputation, or revenge. The usual suspects dressed up in cultural clothing. The sound of the elevator descending interrupted my thoughts. Wolfe was coming down from his morning communion with the orchids, which meant either he had finished early, or Fritz had managed to convey that our visitor was worth his attention. Given Fritz's diplomatic skills and his ability to read the emotional temperature of the house, I suspected the latter. Nero Wolfe entered the office with his usual measured pace, all 1/7 of a ton of him moving with the kind of grace that suggested mass and dignity were not mutually exclusive. He nodded slightly to Miss Pemberton, navigated to his custom-built chair behind the desk, and settled his bulk with the satisfaction of a man assuming his proper place in the universe. "Miss Pemberton," he said, his voice carrying its customary mixture of courtesy and calculation, "Fritz informs me you have brought us a matter concerning the Metropolitan Opera. Mr. Wolfe, someone intends to commit murder tonight during our opening performance of Tosca. I need your help to prevent it." Wolfe's eyebrows rose perhaps a millimeter, which for him constituted a display of interest. He reached for the bell on his desk and rang it once, then extended his hand toward the threatening notes. I collected them and delivered them to his inspection. Fritz appeared in the doorway with a promptness that suggested he had been hovering nearby, ready to provide whatever refreshment might be required for the proper consideration of homicide. "Beer," Wolfe told him, "and perhaps Miss Pemberton would care for coffee." "Coffee would be welcome," she said. Wolfe read the notes with the deliberate attention he gave to everything that crossed his desk, from grocery bills to murder confessions. He examined the paper, held one sheet up to the light to study the watermark, and sniffed delicately at the corner of an envelope. "The stationery is Crane's," he said finally. "Expensive but not rare. The typing is competent but not professional. Someone familiar with a keyboard but not a secretary. The ribbon is worn, suggesting an older machine or one that sees considerable use." He set the papers down and fixed Miss Pemberton with a look that suggested he was taking her measure. "You believe these threats are genuine?" "I believe someone is angry enough to kill, yes. And you came to me rather than the police because the police would cancel the performance, and that would destroy not only tonight, but the entire run. We have critics from London, Paris, and Milan in attendance. We have a sold-out house. And 3 months of advance publicity building to this moment. If we cancel based on what might be an empty threat, we damage the reputation of the Met and the careers of everyone involved. Wolfe took a long sip of the beer Fritz had placed beside him. Miss Pemberton, what exactly do you wish me to accomplish? If someone intends murder, the logical course would be to remove the intended victim from harm's way. I want you to identify the threat and neutralize it before the curtain rises. I want you to save the performance and catch the killer. At the opera? Yes. Wolfe sighed, the sound of a man contemplating the various ways the world conspired to disturb his peace. Miss Pemberton, I do not attend public performances. I do not leave this house for any purpose that can be avoided. If you wish to engage my services, the investigation will be conducted from this office. But how can you solve a case without seeing the scene? Mr. Goodwin serves as my eyes and ears in such matters. He will attend the performance and report his observations. Between now and then, he will interview the relevant parties and gather the information necessary to prevent whatever catastrophe your correspondent has planned. Miss Pemberton looked at me with the expression of someone who had hoped for a thoroughbred and been offered a reliable mule. Will that be sufficient? Lady, I said, Mr. Wolfe's brain doesn't need to leave this chair to solve your problem. I'm his legs, and I've been known to prevent the occasional murder when the situation calls for it. She considered this, glancing back and forth between Wolfe and me as if trying to calculate whether half a loaf was better than none at all. Very well, she said finally. My fee? $500 per day plus expenses, Wolfe said. Payment in advance. She reached for her purse without hesitation, which told me she was either very wealthy or very desperate. Probably both. I'll need a complete list of everyone involved in this production, I said. Cast, crew, board members, major donors, critics, and anyone else who might have strong feelings about your controversial interpretation. That's a considerable number of people, Mr. Goodwin. Then we'd better get started. The curtain goes up in 9 hours, and if someone's planning to kill you tonight, I'd like to know who it is before they get the chance. After she left, Wolfe sat in contemplative silence for several minutes, staring at the threatening notes as if they might reveal their author's identity through sheer force of concentration. Archie, he said finally, what do you know about opera? Enough to know that people die in it regularly, though usually it's part of the show. Indeed. And what do you know about the politics of artistic interpretation? Enough to know that when people start killing over culture, culture is rarely what they're really killing about. Wolfe's mouth twitched in what might have been approval. Precisely. Find out who Miss Pemberton has offended, what interests are threatened by this production, and why someone has chosen tonight's performance as the occasion for murder. The answers, I suspect, will have less to do with artistic sensibilities than with more prosaic motives. I was already reaching for my coat. It was going to be a long day, and if someone was planning to turn Tosca into a real tragedy, I intended to make sure the only blood spilled would be the fake kind that washed off with soap and water. The brown stone settled back into its usual quiet, but I could feel the tension humming beneath the surface like a tuning fork struck against marble. By tonight, either we would have prevented a murder, or Nero Wolfe would have his first case that ended with real curtains falling on a real corpse. I preferred the former option, but in our business, preference and reality don't always. The quiet that settled over the brownstone after Miss Pemberton's departure had the quality of a held breath. I was back at my desk, reviewing the threatening notes and wondering how many opera lovers it took to plan a murder, when the doorbell announced that our peaceful afternoon was officially over. The ring had the authoritative insistence of someone who expected to be taken seriously, and when I opened the door, I understood why. The man on our stoop was built like a question mark, tall, angular, and bent slightly forward as if perpetually examining something that disappointed him. His white hair was swept back from a high forehead, and his eyes held the kind of critical intensity usually reserved for wine tastings and war crimes tribunals. He wore a charcoal overcoat that had been tailored by someone who understood that dignity was a competitive sport. Mr. Goodwin, he said, his voice carrying the cultivated authority of a man accustomed to having his opinions quoted in newspapers. "I am Julian Thorne. I understand that Victoria Pemberton has been here spreading her particular brand of cultural poison." "She was here," I confirmed, stepping aside to let him in. "And you would be someone with strong feelings about her artistic choices." "Strong feelings?" Thorne's voice rose half an octave, a sound like a cello string being tightened past its breaking point. "Mr. Goodwin, what that woman has perpetrated upon Puccini's masterpiece is nothing short of artistic vandalism. She has taken a work of sublime beauty and turned it into a cheap gangster melodrama." I showed him into the office, where Wolfe was examining the threatening notes with the methodical attention he usually reserved for rare stamps or particularly complex recipes. He looked up as we entered, took Thorne's measure in a single glance, and gestured toward the red leather chair. "Mr. Thorne," Wolfe said, settling back in his chair, "I assume you have come to discuss Miss Pemberton's production of Tosca." "I have come," Thorne declared, planting himself in front of Wolfe's desk like a prosecutor addressing a jury, "to ensure that you understand the magnitude of the cultural crime being committed at the Metropolitan Opera tonight. This woman has desecrated a sacred work of art, and someone must be held accountable." "Someone," I said, "has apparently decided to hold her accountable with a knife. Are you familiar with these?" I handed him the threatening notes. Thorne read them with the expression of a man examining evidence of a particularly distasteful crime. His hands, I noticed, were steady, and his reaction seemed genuinely surprised rather than guilty. "Anonymous threats," he said, returning the papers with obvious distaste. "Cowardly and theatrical. Though I must say the sentiment is understandable, if not the method." The doorbell rang again, and I heard Fritz's footsteps in the hall. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward the sound with the resignation of a man watching his orderly world dissolve into chaos. "Mr. Wolfe," Fritz appeared in the doorway. "Miss Tamsin Reed is here. She says Miss Pemberton sent her." "Send her in," Wolfe said, though his tone suggested he would have preferred to send her to a different continent. Tamsin Reed entered the office like a small, efficient hurricane. She was compact and purposeful, with short-cropped auburn hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she spent her days managing temperamental artists and impossible schedules. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who had exactly 15 minutes to solve the world's problems. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, extending a firm handshake. "Tamsin Reed, stage manager at the Met. Miss Pemberton said you needed operational details about tonight's performance." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Please sit. Mr. Thorne was just expressing his views on your production." Reed glanced at Thorne with the weary recognition of someone who had dealt with his type before. "Let me guess. Cultural vandalism, desecration of Puccini, the end of civilization as we know it." "Precisely," Thorne said stiffly. "Right," Reed said, settling into the second red leather chair and opening her portfolio. "Well, while you gentlemen debate artistic merit, someone is planning to turn our fake murder into a real one. These are the floor plans for the stage and backstage areas, prop lists, and personnel rosters for tonight's performance." She spread several documents across Wolfe's desk with the efficiency of a general deploying battle plans. The murder weapon in Act 2 is a retractable stage knife, spring-loaded, completely harmless. But there's also a real carving knife on Scarpia's dinner tray that never leaves the prop table except during the actual scene. "Who has access to these knives?" Wolfe asked. "Props Master Desmond Pike, his assistant, me, the actors involved in the scene, and the dresser assigned to Scarpia's costume changes, plus anyone with a backstage pass, which unfortunately includes about half the board of directors and their guests." Thorne shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Are you suggesting that someone might actually attempt murder during the performance?" "I'm suggesting," Reed said, checking her watch, "that we have exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes to figure out who wants to kill whom and why. before the curtain goes up on what could be the Met's final performance." The office fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of traffic on West 35th Street. Wolfe sat motionless, his eyes half closed, absorbing the information like a computer processing data. The brownstone, which had been peacefully quiet that morning, now hummed with tension and the unmistakable feeling that our evening was going to be considerably more eventful than a typical night at the opera. "Miss Reed," Wolfe said finally, "you will arrange for Mr. Goodwin to have complete backstage access tonight. Mr. Thorne, you will provide me with a list of everyone who shares your passionate opposition to this production, and both of you will consider carefully whether your knowledge of tonight's arrangements might suggest who has both the opportunity and the inclination to turn theatrical murder into the genuine article." The game, as they say, was afoot, or in this case, the opera was about to begin. Sing in harmony. The afternoon brought visitors like a theater calling in its cast for dress rehearsal. By 3 o'clock, our office had been transformed from its usual sanctuary of ordered calm into what Fritz diplomatically called a gathering of artistic temperaments, which was his polite way of saying that the air was thick enough to cut with a stage knife. Victoria Pemberton had returned with reinforcements. A lean, nervous man with paint-stained fingers who introduced himself as Desmond Pike, and a silver-haired woman whose posture suggested she had spent decades correcting other people's mistakes. Dr. Margaret Ashford, I learned, served on the Met's board of directors and had been the most vocal opponent of the modern Tosca production. Pike occupied the red leather chair like a man expecting to be accused of something. As the Met's head of properties, he was responsible for every sword, chalice, and dagger that appeared on stage, including the knife that would kill Scarpia in Act 2. "I've been at the Met for 23 years, he was saying, his voice carrying the defensive tone of a man whose professional competence had been questioned once too often. "I have never, not once, had a prop failure that endangered anyone. My knives are inspected before every performance, tested by me personally, and locked in the prop room between shows." "Yet someone gained access to that room yesterday," Wolfe observed, settling behind his desk with the satisfaction of a man resuming command of his domain. Pike's face went pale. "How did you—" "Miss Reed mentioned it during her earlier visit," I said. "Someone picked the lock while you were at lunch. Nothing missing, but the knife drawer had been opened." Dr. Ashford leaned forward, her expression sharpening. "This is the first I've heard of any break-in. Why wasn't the board notified?" "Because," Pike said miserably, "I wasn't sure anything had actually been taken. The lock was picked professionally. No scratches, no damage. If I hadn't noticed that my knives were arranged differently than I left them, I might not have known anyone had been there at all." Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "Differently how?" "The carving knife, the real one we use in Act 2, was in the wrong slot. I always place it blade down in the felt-lined compartment. Someone had returned it blade up." The silence that followed had weight. Outside, the afternoon traffic hummed along West 35th Street, but inside our office, the implications of that reversed blade hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. "Miss Pemberton," Wolfe said, "you mentioned a list of individuals with both motive and access." She opened her portfolio and extracted several photographs and a typed sheet. "These are the people who have been most vocal in their opposition to the production or who have personal grievances that might motivate violence." I took the materials and spread them across my desk. 5 faces stared back at me, each representing a different flavor of discontent. "Julian Thorne you've met," Pemberton began. "He's threatened publicly to end this travesty. But there's also Gideon Luke, our director. Brilliant, innovative, and convinced that anyone who questions his artistic vision is a Philistine. We've clashed repeatedly over budget overruns and his tendency to make unauthorized changes." The photograph showed a compact man with intense dark eyes and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he ran on caffeine and creative passion. "Then there's Victor Kozlov, our Scarpia," she continued. He hates everything about this production, but is contractually obligated to perform. He's been trying to convince the other principals to demand changes, and he's made no secret of his belief that I've ruined Puccini's masterpiece." Dr. Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "Victor has been difficult. But surely you don't suspect him of planning actual violence." "I suspect everyone until I have reason not to," Wolfe said. "Continue, Miss Pemberton." "Eleanor Vance, our understudy for Tosca. She's been campaigning for the lead role for years and believes she was passed over because of my preference for younger, less traditional voices. And Harrison Finch, a major donor who sees this production as a financial disaster that's alienating our core audience." I studied the photographs, while Wolfe absorbed the information with his usual methodical patience. Pike sat rigidly in his chair, Dr. Ashford maintained her disapproving posture, and Pemberton watched Wolfe's face for some sign of his thinking. "Mr. Pike," Wolfe said finally, "who has keys to the prop room?" "Myself, my assistant Lyle Brenner, Miss Reed as stage manager, and the head of security. That's all." Yet the lock was picked, not opened with a key. This suggests either an outsider with criminal skills or someone who wished to avoid leaving a record of authorized access. Wolfe turned to Dr. Ashford. "How many people have backstage passes for tonight's performance? Board members, major donors, VIP guests, perhaps 40 people in total. Any of whom might have observed Mr. Pike's routines and planned accordingly." Wolfe reached for his beer and took a thoughtful sip. "Miss Pemberton, I will need to interview each of your suspects individually before the performance begins. Can you arrange this?" "I can have them here within 2 hours." "Not here," Wolfe said firmly. "The brownstone is not a parade ground. You will provide a private room at the Opera House where Mr. Goodwin can conduct interviews without interruption or observation." I was already reaching for my coat. The game was definitely afoot, and if someone was planning to turn Tosca into a real tragedy, we had less than 5 hours to identify them and prevent it. "Archie," Wolfe said as I headed for the door, "begin with Mr. Pike's assistant, then the director, then our reluctant Scarpia. People who handle knives professionally understand their capabilities. People who create drama for a living understand timing. And people who feel betrayed understand revenge." The brownstone settled back into temporary quiet as we departed, but I could feel the tension humming beneath the surface like a tuning fork struck against marble. By tonight, either we would have prevented a murder, or the Metropolitan Opera would host its most memorable and final performance of Tosca. The Metropolitan Opera House at 4:30 in the afternoon hummed with the kind of controlled chaos that precedes either triumph or disaster. Victoria Pemberton had secured me a cramped office near the dressing rooms that smelled of grease paint and decades of artistic ambition. Through the thin walls, I could hear singers warming up their voices and stagehands, calling out cues in the theatrical shorthand that makes backstage sound like a foreign country. Tamsin Reed had provided me with an all-access pass and a brief tour of the relevant areas. The Act II set dominated the stage. Scarpia's headquarters rendered as a 1940s police station, complete with a mahogany desk, a drinks cart, and a dinner tray that would feature prominently in tonight's murder scene. More interesting was the stage left wing, where a gap between two masking flats created what Reed called a sightline trap, a pocket where someone could stand unseen by audience, conductor, and most of the crew. "Camera's been glitching there for 3 days, she mentioned casually. "Repair scheduled for tomorrow." Which meant tonight's potential killer would have a perfect blind spot, exactly as the threatening note had suggested when it advised looking to the wings. My first interview was with Lyle Brenner, Pike's assistant and keeper of the prop room keys. He perched on the edge of his chair like a bird ready to take flight, his pale hands betraying a nervous energy that suggested either guilt or chronic anxiety. "The lock was picked professionally," he said, his voice tight with the strain of a man whose competence had been questioned. "No scratches, no damage." If Des hadn't noticed the knife placement was wrong, we might never have known. Wrong how? The carving knife, the real one for Scarpia's dinner scene, was blade up instead of blade down. Des is obsessive about safety protocols. Brenner's fingers drummed against his knee. Someone who knew his habits did this. Anyone been asking about the knives lately? His expression shifted, memory connecting with suspicion. Victor Kozlov, our Scarpia, came by last week, said he wanted to examine the stage knife for Act 2. Spent 20 minutes testing the spring mechanism, asking technical questions. That unusual for a singer? Very. Most performers trust us completely, but Victor knows stage weapons better than half the prop masters I've worked with. Gideon Luke arrived for the second interview like a man conducting an invisible orchestra, his hands moving constantly as he spoke. The director had the fevered intensity of someone who had staked everything on a single artistic vision and found the world insufficiently appreciative of his genius. "This production is revolutionary," he declared before I could ask my first question. "We are stripping away romantic sentimentality to expose the brutal realities of power and corruption that Puccini could only hint at in 1900. Miss Pemberton shares your enthusiasm." Luke's expression darkened. Victoria is a necessary patron, but her taste runs toward the conventional. We've clashed repeatedly over my staging choices, particularly the extended fight sequence in Act 2. Extended how? Traditional productions treat Scarpia's death as a quick thrust and artistic collapse. I've choreographed a realistic struggle. Tosca and Scarpia fight for the knife. It changes hands multiple times. There's rolling, grappling, genuine violence. His eyes lit with artistic fervor. It's visceral, truthful, dangerous. And Miss Pemberton will be watching from the wings? She insists on witnessing what she calls the moment that will vindicate our vision, though I've warned her that stage left can be treacherous for observers. Victor Kozlov entered for the third interview like a man walking to his own execution, resigned but dignified. The bass baritone filled the small office with his presence, and when he spoke, his accented English carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in large spaces. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, settling into the chair with surprising grace for such a large man, "I understand you suspect me of planning murder. Should I? In artistic sense, perhaps. This production murders Puccini's masterpiece, so turnabout might be fair." His smile held no warmth. "But I am singer, not killer, though this travesty makes me wish otherwise." "You've been studying the prop knives." "Professional necessity. Luke's choreography is energetic. I needed to understand the weapon's limitations." Kozlov leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mr. Goodwin, if someone wanted to kill during that scene, they would not need to switch knives. The prop knife's safety mechanism could be sabotaged, a small file, few minutes' work. Spring would compress normally during testing but fail under performance stress. The implications hit me like a cold wind. The blade would extend when it should retract. Precisely. Physics would do the killing, very clean, very clever." He stood, straightening his jacket. "I tell you this because I do not wish to be blamed for accident that kills woman I merely dislike." As Kozlov left, I sat alone with the sound of a theater preparing for opening night and the growing certainty that someone had already prepared for murder. We weren't looking for a simple weapon switch. We were looking for someone clever enough to turn a safety mechanism into a death trap. 2 hours until curtain, and the circle was tightening around a killer who understood that the most effective murders were the ones that looked like accidents. I returned to the brownstone at 6:15 with the uncomfortable feeling that tonight's murder would be more elegant than anyone had anticipated. Wolfe was at his desk examining what appeared to be technical drawings, his beer positioned at the precise angle that indicated serious mental excavation was in progress. "Archie," he said without looking up, "your afternoon has been productive, I trust." "Productive and disturbing," I said, settling into my chair. Victor Kozlov thinks our killer doesn't need to switch knives. The prop knife's safety mechanism could be sabotaged with a small file, a few strategic scratches on the spring housing. It would test fine during rehearsal, but fail under the stress of Luke's extended fight choreography. Physics would do the killing. Wolfe set down his drawings and gave me his full attention. A filed spring, ingenious and cowardly. It transforms an instrument of illusion into one of execution while leaving no trace of intent on the perpetrator. Gets better, I continued. There's a camera blind spot in stage left where someone could work unobserved. Reed says it's been glitching for 3 days, repair scheduled for tomorrow. Perfect timing for someone who knows the theater's surveillance patterns. Indeed. Wolfe reached for his beer with the deliberate calm he maintained when genuinely disturbed. However, we have a more immediate concern. Someone has been in this office during your absence. That got my attention. How do you know? Fritz noticed my desk blotter was misaligned by perhaps 1/8 of an inch. The pencils in my right-hand cup had been reversed, soft leads where hard should be. Small violations, but violations nonetheless. His eyes narrowed. I examined the blotter under raking light. Fresh indentations from someone copying information. 3 lines of text pressed through from above. I leaned forward. What did they copy? Act 2. Look left wings. Camera dead. Precisely the intelligence you've just confirmed. Wolfe opened his desk drawer and extracted a small evidence envelope. I also found this torn corner of yellow legal paper in my wastebasket, bearing traces of stage makeup. Castor oil base with sepia pigment. Someone who'd been backstage recently. Or someone who wished to appear so. More significantly, 1 sheet of our letterhead is missing from the lower drawer. Not an envelope, just the paper itself. The implications were ugly. To forge authorization? A backstage pass? Possibly. Or to create the impression of official cooperation. Wolfe's expression darkened. The trespass was subtle, Archie. Almost tender. That suggests either remarkable skill or intimate knowledge of this house and its routines. The phone rang, interrupting our analysis. I answered with professional courtesy and found myself talking to Harrison Finch, the major donor Victoria Pemberton had mentioned. Mr. Goodwin. Finch's cultured voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. I understand you've been asking questions about tonight's performance. I'm prepared to pay Mr. Wolfe's fee to discontinue this investigation. $10,000 cash, delivered within the hour. I covered the receiver and relayed the offer. Wolfe's response was immediate. Tell Mr. Finch we do not accept payment to ignore murder. Finch's reaction was swift and cold. Then you've chosen poorly, Mr. Goodwin. Some investigations prove more dangerous than the crimes they seek to prevent. The line went dead, leaving us with the kind of silence that follows ultimatums. Well, I said, that was either confirmation we're on the right track, or we just made a very expensive enemy. Before Wolfe could respond, Fritz appeared with his diplomatic expression. Mr. Wolfe, Miss Eleanor Vance is here. She appears quite distressed. Eleanor Vance entered like a woman who had run out of time and options. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with stage presence that commanded attention, but tonight she looked like someone carrying the weight of a dangerous secret. Mr. Wolfe, she said, declining the offered chair, I know who's been watching your house, and I know why they broke in here. The office fell silent except for the wall clock's measured ticking. The threatening notes were misdirection, she continued, her voice steady despite obvious strain. Someone needed Victoria positioned in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, not as a victim, but as a witness. The perfect witness to what will appear to be a tragic accident. Wolfe leaned back, his eyes half closed in maximum processing mode. Miss Vance, you're suggesting the murder is designed to require Miss Pemberton's testimony. I'm suggesting someone has turned her fear into a weapon. She'll be standing in that blind spot, watching for danger when the real crime happens, and she'll swear it was an accident because that's exactly what it will look like. The brownstone seemed to hold its breath as the implications settled over us. We weren't just preventing a murder. We were unraveling a conspiracy that had already invaded our sanctuary and corrupted the very instruments of theatrical art. 2 hours until curtain, and the subtle trespass was complete. Eleanor Vance's revelation settled over the office like the moment before thunder. She moved to the red leather chair with the careful precision of someone who had finally decided to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences. "Miss Vance," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern, "you possess information that could prevent murder, yet you've waited until now to share it." "Why?" "Because until this afternoon I thought I was part of an elaborate practical joke." The words came out flat, without drama or excuse. 3 days ago, someone approached me backstage. They wore maintenance coveralls and a surgical mask, claimed to be checking air quality. Very professional, very convincing. They knew details about my career, my financial situation, my frustrations with being passed over for leading roles. I leaned forward. "They wanted you to sabotage the prop knife. File a few scratches on the spring housing, just enough to make it fail during the extended fight scene. Victoria would be humiliated, the production would close, and traditional opera would be vindicated. $20,000, cash in advance." Her voice carried the bitter recognition of someone who had discovered the true price of compromise. "But that wasn't the real plan," Wolfe observed. "No, the real target is Victor Kozlov. He's been gathering evidence of financial irregularities related to this production, funds diverted from the Met's endowment to cover a secret investment that went sour. He was going to expose it after opening night, meet with a journalist tomorrow morning." The phone rang, cutting through the revelation like a blade. Tamsin Reed's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Goodwin, we have multiple problems. Someone's been in the prop room again. Lyle Brenner was found unconscious, and the real carving knife from Scarpia's dinner tray is missing. But that's not the worst part. The stage knife has been replaced with a perfect replica, except the spring mechanism has been professionally rebuilt. This isn't sabotage. It's precision engineering designed to kill." I relayed the information to Wolfe, whose expression shifted to genuine alarm. "Miss Reed," Wolfe said, taking the phone, "you will immediately secure the area and replace that weapon with an unmodified backup. Do not allow anyone near the prop room without Mr. Goodwin present." "Already done," Reed replied. "But Mr. Wolfe, whoever made this switch knew our inventory system perfectly. They left proper paperwork, signed with Pike's initials, dated yesterday. If I hadn't been specifically looking for tampering, I would never have noticed." After Wolfe hung up, the doorbell rang with official insistence. Fritz appeared with his diplomatic composure slightly cracked. "Mr. Wolfe, Detective Morrison, NYPD. They have a warrant to search the premises in connection with threats against the Metropolitan Opera." The compact detective entered with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Wolfe, we've received an anonymous tip that you're harboring evidence related to planned violence at tonight's performance. Very specific information about threatening notes." Wolfe's reaction was controlled but volcanic. "Someone has perverted the machinery of law enforcement to disrupt our investigation precisely when we're closest to identifying the killer." As Morrison examined our files, I reached for the phone. "Saul? Archie. We need you at the Met now. Full surveillance package. Someone's using official channels to slow us down, and they've escalated to physical violence." Saul's voice came through crisp and professional. "Already moving. I've been tracking a tan Plymouth that's been watching your brownstone. Plate traces to a rental paid by cash. Renter matching the description of Julian Thorne's assistant. Also intercepted radio chatter about a maintenance authorization using forged letterhead. Someone's been very busy." The pressure was mounting from all directions. Eleanor Vance sat in stunned recognition of how she'd been manipulated. Detective Morrison was examining evidence that had been contaminated by our earlier intruder, And somewhere at the Metropolitan Opera, a killer was making final preparations to turn Victor Kozlov's knowledge into a death sentence. "Miss Vance," Wolfe said with icy precision, "you will remain here under Fritz's protection. Archie, return to the Met immediately. Find Mr. Pike, secure the prop room, and locate Mr. Kozlov. Ensure he understands the danger." I was already reaching for my coat. The intellectual chess game had become a deadly race against time, with curtain rising in 75 minutes and a killer who had demonstrated both technical sophistication and willingness to use violence. The brownstone sanctuary had been violated, our investigation had been compromised by official interference, and someone was preparing to commit the perfect murder in front of 3,000 witnesses. The pressure had increased beyond mere tension. It had become the air we breathed, thick with the certainty that tonight's performance would end in either triumph or tragedy, with no middle ground remaining. I returned to the brownstone to find Detective Morrison methodically violating our sanctuary with the grim efficiency of a man following orders he didn't particularly believe in. He was examining Wolfe's desk blotter with a magnifying glass, while Wolfe observed from his chair with the detached interest of a naturalist watching a particularly slow beetle. "Detective," Wolfe said as I entered, "you are welcome to continue your archaeological expedition, but I suggest your time would be better spent at the Metropolitan Opera, where someone has committed actual assault and theft rather than theoretical conspiracy." Morrison looked up from his examination. "Anonymous tip was very specific about threatening notes and planned violence, Mr. Wolfe. Came from someone who knew details about your investigation." "Indeed," Wolfe replied, "which suggests our true adversary has been closer than we realized." He turned to me with the expression of a man who had reached his final gambit. "Archie, attend carefully. You will execute the following instructions in precise order." I pulled out my notebook, recognizing the tone that meant Wolfe had solved the puzzle and was now positioning the pieces for checkmate. "First, contact Miss Reed immediately. There will be a complete safety audit of all stage weapons. No metal blades of any kind will be permitted during tonight's performance. Publicly, this is precautionary. Privately, you will personally secure any questionable items." "That'll cause an uproar." "Excellent. Second, Miss Pemberton is not to observe from stage left as planned. You will relocate her to the stage right prompt corner, but you will tell Mr. Luke, Mr. Finch, and Dr. Ashford that she insists on maintaining her original position. I require controlled misinformation." The phone rang, interrupting his instructions. Saul's voice came through with professional calm. "Wolfe, your office visitor has been identified. Beverly Crane, Harrison Finch's personal assistant. She's currently backstage at the Met, attempting to access the prop room with forged authorization bearing Archie's signature. Also, Victor Kozlov is secure but agitated. Says he has documentation proving $3 million from the Met's endowment was diverted to a failed real estate investment." Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "The financial irregularities Miss Vance mentioned. Mr. Finch's motive becomes clear." He took the phone. "Saul, maintain surveillance on Miss Crane, but do not detain her yet. I need her to complete her intended actions under observation." After hanging up, Wolfe continued his instructions. "Third, you will prepare a sealed envelope containing this message. Carving knife located, stage left cable trunk. Delivered to Reed immediately. Have Mr. Pike accidentally drop it near the Green Room coffee station. Saul will observe who retrieves it. Bait. Precisely. Fourth, Mr. Kozlov will remain in his dressing room under protection, but he is to be told that the prop knife has been replaced with a safe version. Fifth, you will inform Mr. Finch that I am prepared to discuss his generous offer tomorrow at 11, provided tonight concludes without incident. Then observe his reaction carefully." Morrison had stopped his search and was listening with growing interest. "Finch, the opera donor, what kind of financial irregularities?" "The kind that motivate murder, Detective," Wolfe replied. "Miss Crane broke into this office this morning, copying intelligence about tonight's investigation. The anonymous tip that brought you here was designed to disrupt our efforts at the crucial moment. I was already reaching for my coat. The net's closing. Indeed. Miss Crane needed Miss Pemberton positioned as the perfect witness to what would appear to be a tragic accident. Mr. Kozlov's death would eliminate the threat of financial exposure while discrediting the production that Miss Pemberton championed. The brownstones' violated quiet now hummed with purposeful energy. Wolfe had transformed the disruption into opportunity, using the official interference to reveal the conspiracy's true scope. "Archie," Wolfe said as I headed for the door, "the killer has demonstrated both technical sophistication and willingness to use violence. They have also shown intimate knowledge of our methods and the theater's operations. Trust no one completely, but remember, they need Miss Pemberton alive to witness the accident. That gives us leverage." I left the brownstone with the feeling that the intellectual chess match was entering its final moves. Wolfe's positioning had revealed the true players and their motives. Now it remained to execute his strategy before the curtain rose on what someone intended to be Victor Kozlov's final performance. The game was no longer about preventing murder. It was about exposing conspiracy and ensuring that when the final curtain fell, justice would take its bow alongside the cast. By 9:30, our office had been transformed from its usual sanctuary of ordered calm into what Fritz diplomatically called a convocation of artistic temperaments, which was his polite way of saying that the air was thick enough to cut with either a stage knife or a real one. The red leather chairs had been supplemented with additional seating arranged in a precise semicircle facing Wolfe's desk, creating the atmosphere of a courtroom where judgment was about to be rendered. Harrison Finch occupied the position of honor in the first red leather chair, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his expression carrying the confident authority of a man accustomed to buying his way out of inconvenient situations. Dr. Margaret Ashford sat rigidly beside him, her disapproval radiating like heat from a furnace, while Julian Thorne had positioned himself slightly apart, maintaining the artistic distance of someone who considered himself above mere financial scandal. Beverly Crane perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her efficient demeanor cracked by the growing realization that her morning's burglary had been observed and documented. Desmond Pike hunched miserably nearby, still nursing both his bruises and his wounded professional pride. Eleanor Vance completed the primary gathering, her stage presence intact despite the weight of her confession, while Tamsin Reed stood near the door with the controlled tension of a stage manager watching for her cue. Victor Kozlov, the evening's intended victim, stood near the globe like a man who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. Through Saul's efficient work, he had been extracted safely from the Met during the first intermission and delivered to our brownstone with the news that the performance was proceeding with rubber knives and heightened security. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe began, settling behind his desk with the satisfaction of a conductor preparing to direct a complex symphony. "You have been summoned here because each of you participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in a conspiracy to commit murder during tonight's performance of Tosca. The attempt failed, but not through any deficiency in planning or execution." Finch's reaction was immediate and predictable. "This is preposterous, Wolfe. I've done nothing but support the arts in this city for 30 years. My reputation, your reputation," Wolfe interrupted with icy courtesy, "is precisely what motivated this elaborate conspiracy. Mr. Finch, you diverted $3 million from the Metropolitan Opera's endowment to cover losses from a failed real estate venture in Brooklyn. When Mr. Kozlov discovered your embezzlement through his review of the Met's financial records, you required his permanent silence." The office fell silent except for the wall clock's measured ticking and Dr. Ashford's sharp intake of breath. Her face had gone pale as she stared at her fellow board member with a horrified recognition of someone discovering a serpent in her garden. The web of deception. The threatening notes sent to Miss Pemberton were masterful misdirection, Wolfe continued, his voice carrying the methodical precision of a surgeon exposing diseased tissue. "They served multiple purposes. positioning Miss Pemberton as the perfect witness to what would appear to be a tragic accident, creating the impression that she was the intended victim and providing justification for her presence in the precise location where your conspiracy required her testimony. He gestured toward the evidence spread across his desk. Miss Crane, acting on your instructions, studied our investigation methods by violating this office and copying our intelligence. The torn corner of yellow legal paper bearing traces of stage makeup that I found in my wastebasket came from the same pad used to wrap the real carving knife you planted as evidence. Beverly Crane's composure finally cracked completely. He said it was just corporate intelligence gathering, protecting the Met's reputation from scandal. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. Miss Crane, Wolfe said with devastating calm, you possess mechanical skills acquired during your previous employment with Theatrical Properties Limited in Chicago. You understood exactly how to file the spring mechanism on the prop knife, transforming it from a safety device into an instrument of death. Under the stress of Mr. Luke's extended fight choreography, the blade would have extended fatally into Mr. Kozlov's chest. Pike straightened in his chair, professional outrage overcoming his nervousness. The knife I examined this afternoon had been completely rebuilt, not just filed. That wasn't sabotage. That was precision engineering designed to kill. Precisely, Mr. Pike. Miss Crane's expertise ensured that the weapon would test safely during rehearsal, but fail catastrophically during performance. However, when Mr. Goodwin's investigation began closing in, and when Miss Vance refused to participate in the sabotage, a more direct approach became necessary. The perfect murder. Wolfe reached for his beer and took a measured sip before continuing. The ultimate plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its calculation. The sabotaged prop knife would fail during the struggle, appearing to malfunction under stress. In the confusion, the real carving knife, conveniently planted in the stage-left cable trunk within the camera blind spot, would be used to deliver the fatal wound. Miss Pemberton, positioned as the sole witness and believing she was watching for potential danger, would testify that Mr. Kozlov's death was a tragic accident resulting from the prop knife's mechanical failure. Eleanor Vance leaned forward, her voice tight with recognition. The $20,000 Harrison offered me. It was never about humiliating Victoria or closing the production. You needed someone inside the theater to make the weapon switch, someone who could access the prop room without suspicion. Indeed, Miss Vance, you possessed legitimate access, plausible motivation, and financial vulnerability. However, you also possessed sufficient moral sense to confess when you realized the true scope of the conspiracy. Wolfe's gaze shifted to Finch. When Miss Vance refused to participate, Miss Crane was forced to handle the technical aspects personally, leaving traces of her presence that ultimately exposed the entire plot. Dr. Ashford found her voice, though it carried the hollow tone of someone watching her world collapse. Harrison, how could you steal from the institution we've devoted our lives to protecting? Finch's authority was evaporating like stage fog. The Brooklyn development would have brought prestige and profit to the Met. The investment failed through market forces beyond my control. I was protecting the opera's future, not destroying it. The evidence. Mr. Finch, Wolfe said, producing the sealed evidence envelope. Miss Crane retrieved this decoy message from the green room coffee station, believing it contained intelligence about the weapon's location. Mr. Panzer observed and photographed her actions. We also have documentation of the forged authorization she used to access the prop room, bearing Mr. Goodwin's purported signature. I stepped forward, placing additional evidence on Wolfe's desk. We also have the real carving knife, found exactly where our bait led Miss Crane to plant it. The yellow legal paper wrapping bears microscopic traces of the same stage makeup found in our wastebasket this morning. Victor Kozlov spoke for the first time since entering the office, his accented voice carrying the weight of a man who had narrowly escaped death. Mr. Wolfe, I have documentation proving the $3 million diversion, bank records, forged authorizations, correspondence with the Brooklyn developers, I was to meet with a financial crimes investigator tomorrow morning, which necessitated your death tonight," Wolfe observed. Mr. Kozlov's elimination would have served dual purposes, silencing the witness to your embezzlement and discrediting Miss Pemberton's controversial production through association with tragedy. Two problems solved with a single, apparently accidental death. Justice served. The gathering sat in stunned recognition of the conspiracy's elegant brutality. Finch had slumped in his chair, the fight gone out of him, while Beverly Crane stared at her hands as if seeing blood on them for the first time. "Detective Morrison," Wolfe said, reaching for his phone, "your presence is required. We have your actual criminals, complete with evidence, confession, and motive. The anonymous tip that brought you here this afternoon was part of their attempt to disrupt our investigation at the crucial moment." As we waited for the authorities, the office settled into the kind of quiet that follows the resolution of complex problems. Outside, the final act of Tosca was reaching its climactic conclusion, but here in our brownstone, the real drama had ended with justice rather than tragedy. "Mr. Finch," Wolfe said with finality, "your attempt to preserve your reputation has destroyed it utterly. Miss Crane, your loyalty was admirable but catastrophically misplaced. The Metropolitan Opera will survive your depredations, but neither of you will survive the consequences of your actions. The brownstone had been violated, our investigation had been compromised, and murder had been attempted in the most sophisticated manner I'd encountered in years of working with Wolfe. But in the end, the intellectual precision that made Nero Wolfe formidable had prevailed over the desperate cleverness of those who believed money and influence could purchase immunity from justice. The curtain had fallen, but unlike in Puccini's tragedy, the right people were taking their final bows. Detective Morrison arrived with 2 uniformed officers and the professional resignation of a man who had spent his afternoon chasing phantom conspiracies only to discover the real thing had been unfolding under his nose. Saul Panzer followed them in, carrying a manila folder with the casual precision of someone delivering a perfectly prepared indictment. The office had been transformed into an amphitheater of judgment. Harrison Finch occupied the first red leather chair, his silver hair no longer perfectly groomed, his face bearing the gray pallor of a man watching 30 years of reputation dissolve in real time. Dr. Margaret Ashford sat rigidly beside him, her disapproval radiating like heat from a furnace as she stared at her fellow board member with the horrified recognition of someone discovering a viper in her garden. Beverly Crane perched on the edge of a wooden chair, her efficient demeanor completely shattered by the growing realization that her morning's burglary had been observed, documented, and would now serve as evidence in her own prosecution. Eleanor Vance maintained her stage presence despite the weight of her near participation in murder, while Victor Kozlov stood near the globe like a man who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. Wolfe settled behind his desk with the satisfaction of a conductor preparing to direct the final movement of a complex symphony. He reached for his beer, took a measured sip, and began. The Architecture of Conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wolfe said, his voice carrying the methodical precision of a surgeon exposing diseased tissue, "you have been summoned here because each of you participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in a conspiracy to commit murder during tonight's performance of Tosca. The attempt failed, but not through any deficiency in planning or execution." Harrison Finch's reaction was immediate and predictable. "This is preposterous, Wolfe. I've done nothing but support the arts in this city for 30 years. "Mr. Finch," Wolfe interrupted with icy courtesy, "your 30 years of service make your betrayal more heinous, not less. You diverted $3 million from the Metropolitan Opera's endowment to cover losses from a failed real estate venture in Brooklyn. When Mr. Kozlov discovered your embezzlement through his review of the Met's financial records, you required his permanent silence." The office fell silent except for the wall clock's measured ticking and Dr. Ashford's sharp intake of breath. Her face had gone pale as she absorbed the magnitude of institutional betrayal. The threatening notes sent to Miss Pemberton, Wolfe continued, were masterful misdirection. They served multiple purposes, positioning Miss Pemberton as the perfect witness to what would appear to be a tragic accident, creating the impression that she was the intended victim and providing justification for her presence in the precise location where your conspiracy required her testimony. The technical perfection. Wolfe gestured toward the evidence spread across his desk. Miss Crane, acting on your instructions and drawing upon her expertise from previous employment with Theatrical Properties Limited in Chicago, understood exactly how to transform a safety device into an instrument of death. The prop knife's spring mechanism was not merely filed, it was completely rebuilt. Beverly Crane looked up from her hands, her voice barely audible. The spring housing was engineered to compress normally under light testing pressure, but fracture catastrophically under the dynamic stress of Mr. Luke's extended fight choreography. It would have appeared to be a tragic mechanical failure, nothing more. Precisely, Wolfe said. However, when Mr. Goodwin's investigation began closing in, and when Miss Vance refused to participate in the sabotage, a more direct approach became necessary. The real carving knife from Scarpia's dinner tray was stolen and planted in the stage-left cable trunk within the camera blind spot that Miss Crane had so conveniently arranged to malfunction. Desmond Pike straightened with professional indignation. 23 years I've been responsible for stage weapons at the Met. 23 years without a single accident. You perverted my safety protocols into murder weapons. The perfect witness. The ultimate plan, Wolfe continued, was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its calculation. Miss Pemberton, positioned as the sole witness and believing she was watching for potential danger, would testify that Mr. Kozlov's death was a tragic accident resulting from the prop knife's mechanical failure. Her reputation for honesty and her known opposition to the production's critics would have made her testimony unquestionable. Victoria Pemberton found her voice, though it carried the hollow tone of someone discovering how thoroughly she had been manipulated. You needed me to see Victor's death and swear it was accidental. My credibility would have closed the investigation while discrediting the production I championed. Indeed, 2 problems solved with a single, apparently accidental death. Silencing the witness to your embezzlement and destroying the controversial production through association with tragedy. The fatal evidence. Saul stepped forward, opening his folder with practiced efficiency. Mr. Wolfe, the surveillance photographs show Miss Crane retrieving the decoy message about the knife's location from the Green Room coffee station. We also have documentation of the forged maintenance authorization she used to access the prop room, bearing Mr. Goodwin's purported signature. I placed the real carving knife, wrapped in its yellow legal paper shroud, on Wolfe's desk. Found exactly where our bait led Miss Crane to plant it. The wrapping paper has sepia cream traces matching the stage makeup found in our wastebasket this morning. Dr. Ashford turned to Finch with the steady horror of a woman discovering that her life's work had been built on a foundation of theft. Harrison, 30 years we've served together on that board. How could you betray everything we've worked to protect? Finch's authority was evaporating like stage fog. The Brooklyn development would have generated millions in revenue for the Met. When it failed, I was protecting the opera's future by preventing the scandal of a failed investment. Everything I did was for the institution. Everything you did, Wolfe said with devastating precision, was to conceal your theft of $3 million from the Metropolitan Opera's endowment. But that wasn't the full extent of your depredations, was it? Finch's composure cracked completely. Over the past 5 years, I've diverted nearly $8 million from various Metropolitan Opera accounts. The Brooklyn development was just the most recent failure. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Dr. Ashford gasped audibly, while Eleanor Vance stared at Finch with the horrified recognition of someone discovering the true scope of institutional betrayal. Justice delivered. Miss Crane, Wolfe said, turning to the broken woman in the wooden chair. "Your loyalty was admirable but catastrophically misplaced. You were manipulated into becoming an accessory to both theft and attempted murder by a man who perverted your devotion to art into service of his greed." Beverly Crane looked up through her tears. "He told me it was corporate damage control, protecting the Met's reputation from scandal that would damage the opera's funding. I thought I was helping preserve something beautiful." Detective Morrison stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Harrison Finch, Beverly Crane, you're both under arrest. Mr. Finch for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit murder. Miss Crane for conspiracy to commit murder, breaking and entering, and obstruction of justice." As the authorities led the conspirators away, Finch made one final attempt at justification. "I was protecting the Met from ruin." "You were protecting yourself, Mr. Finch," Wolfe corrected, his voice cutting through the departing footsteps. "The Metropolitan Opera will survive your depredations. Your reputation, however, will not." The philosophical conclusion. As the brownstone settled back into its customary quiet, Dr. Ashford remained in her chair, her face bearing the weight of institutional responsibility. "Mr. Wolfe, how does the Metropolitan Opera survive this betrayal? How do we repair $8 million in theft and the damage to our reputation?" Wolfe folded his hands across his middle, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a man who had restored order to a disordered world. "Dr. Ashford, institutions survive through the dedication of people like yourself who place service above self-interest. Mr. Finch's theft is a wound, but not a fatal one. The opera will endure because its mission transcends any individual's corruption." Viktor Kozlov spoke from his position near the globe, his accented voice carrying the weight of a man who had faced death and found meaning in survival. "Mr. Wolfe, you have saved not only a performance, but an institution. Art can survive poor reviews, but it cannot survive the conversion of its sacred spaces into venues for murder." "Precisely, Mr. Kozlov. What Mr. Finch attempted was not merely theft or murder, but the corruption of art itself, turning the stage into a killing ground and the audience into unwitting accomplices. Such perversion offends not only law, but civilization." As the last of our visitors departed, the brownstone reclaimed its peaceful dignity. The conspiracy had been exposed, the murder prevented, and justice served with the methodical precision that characterized all of Nero Wolfe's investigations. The curtain had fallen on both Tosca and our own drama, but unlike Puccini's tragedy, the right people were taking their final bows. The brownstone exhaled after the last uniform left, and the silence had the weight of a verdict rendered and accepted. Fritz closed the front door with a soft click that announced the restoration of our sanctuaries in violet peace, then moved through the office with his diplomatic efficiency, removing the extra chairs and restoring the proper balance between furniture and tranquility. The air still carried faint traces of the evening's drama. Fear, ambition, and the particular tension that accompanies the exposure of long-hidden corruption, but these were already being absorbed into the brownstone's deeper quiet. I was at my desk, typing up the final notes while the details remained sharp in my memory. The threatening letters lay in their evidence envelope, transformed from instruments of terror into mere exhibits for what would become a very public trial. The yellow legal paper that had wrapped the real carving knife sat in its protective sleeve, bearing microscopic traces of stage makeup that would help convict Beverly Crane of conspiracy to commit murder. Wolfe had returned to his chair behind the desk with the satisfaction of a man resuming his proper place in the universe. He was examining the evening's mail with methodical attention, though I suspected he was actually processing the psychological complexities of the case we had just concluded. His beer sat at the precise angle that indicated serious mental digestion was in progress. The practical reckoning. Dr. Margaret Ashford had remained after the arrests, her sense of institutional responsibility requiring a complete understanding of the damage Harrison Finch had inflicted upon the Metropolitan Opera. She occupied the red leather chair with the rigid posture of someone absorbing the full weight of betrayal while calculating the practical steps necessary for recovery. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, her voice carrying the controlled authority of a woman accustomed to managing crises. "The board will meet in emergency session tomorrow morning. We need forensic accountants, insurance investigators, and probably federal authorities. 30 years of financial records will require complete review." "Dr. Ashford," Wolfe replied, setting aside his correspondence, "Mr. Kozlov's documentation will provide the foundation for your investigation. However, I suspect Mr. Finch's confession understated the extent of his depredations. Men who steal $8 million rarely begin with such ambitious theft." She nodded grimly. "The institution has survived fire, economic depression, world war, and changing public tastes. We'll survive this betrayal as well, though the recovery will require both time and unwavering dedication." The phone rang, interrupting our analysis. Victoria Pemberton's voice came through with a mixture of relief and exhaustion that suggested she had aged several years in the past 12 hours. "Mr. Wolfe," the performance concluded to thunderous applause, despite the rubber knives and heightened security. The critics from London, Paris, and Milan were unanimous. They called it a triumph of artistic courage over institutional timidity. Her voice carried a note of ironic satisfaction. Harrison's attempt to destroy the production through association with tragedy may have guaranteed its place in operatic history. "Miss Pemberton," Wolfe observed, "scandal often validates what conventional wisdom condemns. Your controversial interpretation survived not only critical opposition, but actual conspiracy. That constitutes a rather definitive artistic vindication." The evening's restoration. After Dr. Ashford departed to begin the long process of institutional reconstruction, the brownstone settled into its customary evening rhythm. Fritz appeared with his diplomatic expression and the announcement that dinner would be served in 20 minutes, rack of lamb with roasted vegetables and a wine selected to complement both the meal and the evening's successful resolution. Wolfe retired to the plant rooms for his communion with the orchids, leaving me to complete my report and reflect on the day's events. The Metropolitan Opera was already planning enhanced security protocols. Victor Kozlov was being hailed as a hero for his courage in exposing the financial irregularities, and somewhere in the city, Julian Thorne was probably drafting a column about civilization being rescued from barbarism by competent people. At precisely 8 o'clock, we gathered in the dining room. The heavy oak table gleamed under the soft light of the chandelier, and Fritz's culinary artistry transformed the meal into a celebration of order restored. Wolfe ate with his usual meticulous attention, savoring each bite while his mind processed the deeper implications of the case. The philosophical resolution. "Archie," Wolfe said, pausing between mouthfuls of perfectly prepared lamb, "what did you make of Miss Crane's participation in this conspiracy?" I considered the question while reviewing the evening's revelations. She was manipulated by someone who understood her loyalty and perverted it into service of his greed. Finch told her she was protecting art when she was actually helping destroy it. Precisely. Miss Crane's tragedy was not her criminality, but her misplaced devotion. She possessed genuine love for the opera and allowed that love to be weaponized against the institution she sought to protect. Wolfe reached for his wineglass with deliberate ceremony. The true offense tonight was not merely the attempt to kill Mr. Kozlov, but the corruption of art's machinery for purposes of murder. It proposed that illusion should carry the weight of a corpse. He paused, his expression growing more contemplative. "Art, Archie, is an arrangement of lies that aspires to truth. Murder is an arrangement of means that aspires to permanence. Mr. Finch's conspiracy sought to use the former in service of the latter, a perversion that offends not only law but civilization itself." "And the moral of the story?" "The moral," Wolfe said, setting down his glass with finality, "is that the most dangerous deceptions are those we practice upon ourselves. Mr. Finch genuinely believed he was protecting the institution, even as he systematically plundered it. He mistook his personal financial ambitions for the collective good, a common failing among those who confuse their self-worth with their net worth. The final quiet. After dinner, Wolfe permitted himself one cigar on the stoop, a concession to the mild evening air and the satisfaction of justice properly served. I joined him because anyone who breaks into our office earns me at least a beer and some fresh air. The night was clean and sharp, with taxis combing the avenue and the distant sound of the city's eternal performance continuing around us. The trespass this morning was instructive, Wolfe said, puffing thoughtfully. It demonstrated how close vanity will creep to principle when money holds the leash. But it also revealed the essential weakness of such conspiracies. They require the corruption of others, and corruption, unlike loyalty, cannot be sustained indefinitely. Inside again, Fritz was completing his evening ministrations, ensuring that tomorrow would begin with the same ordered perfection that had been temporarily disrupted but never truly threatened. Wolfe paused at the elevator and fixed me with his characteristic look of benevolent authority. "Archie, tomorrow you will return the forged authorization to Detective Morrison and retrieve our missing letterhead from evidence. Also, send Miss Pemberton her final invoice with a surcharge for institutional turbulence, and inform Mr. Luke that his fight choreography may remain as vigorous as he wishes, provided his weapons remain permanently harmless." As the elevator carried him up to his evening consultation with the orchids, I settled at my desk to complete the case files. The brownstone had been violated, our investigation had been compromised by official interference, and murder had been attempted in the most sophisticated manner I'd encountered in years of working with Wolfe. But in the end, the intellectual precision that made Nero Wolfe formidable had prevailed over the desperate cleverness of those who believed money and influence could purchase immunity from justice. The threatening notes were filed away as evidence. The conspiracy had been exposed with surgical precision, and the Metropolitan Opera would continue its mission of creating beauty in a world that too often settled for less. The curtain had fallen on both Tosca and our own drama, but unlike Puccini's tragedy, the right people had survived to sing another day. The last word. "Archie," Wolfe's voice drifted down from the plant rooms, carrying the satisfaction of a man who had restored order to a disordered world. "Appetite is honest. It cannot be laundered or perverted to serve false purposes. Men may corrupt institutions, art, and even justice, but they cannot corrupt the fundamental hungers that drive human aspiration. That, perhaps, is why truth eventually prevails. It feeds something that lies cannot nourish." I turned off the office lights and headed upstairs, leaving the brownstone to its peaceful dreams. Tomorrow would bring new problems, new clients, and probably new attempts to disturb our ordered existence. But tonight, justice had taken its bows alongside the cast, and that was performance enough for any reasonable man. The Metropolitan Opera would survive, Victor Kozlov would continue singing, and somewhere in the city, art would endure despite the efforts of those who sought to corrupt it. In the end, that was perhaps the most satisfying resolution of all. Not merely the prevention of murder, but the preservation of something beautiful in a world that needed all the beauty it could get.